Okay, so let's begin. I'm very pleased to open up this panel. This is a new book being published by colleague Jean Cohen. It's hard to imagine a topic that is of more relevance, not just to American politics, but countries worldwide, is struggle with the challenges that new populist movements are presenting to democracy. It's hard to fathom that what we're seeing in the United States is happening right now in a lot of dimensions, but here's where we are, and I think this book is going to help us understand to a large extent what's happening, why it's happening, and what the future brings. Jean will get to go last, and I'm going to introduce the other panelists first. So immediately to my right is Jedediah Purdy, who is just across the way in the law school. You can't see it because the blinds are closed, but the only building that rivals IAB in its beauty on campus is the law school. And then Mabel Berezin is the next panelist. She's from Cornell University. And then we have Cheri Berman from Barnard, just across the way on across Amsterdam.
Nicer building.
Nicer building, yes. And the campus has gotten a lot nicer over there too. So lots of renovations going on across. We're jealous over here on the side of Broadway in Amsterdam. So I don't want to take any more time. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists because we have a very strict schedule. But each of the panelists will present comments. Then Jean will get to respond. And then we are going to, I'm sorry, Jean is going to introduce the book, then the panelists, and then Jean will respond, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
I was thinking, why did I spend all my time trying to make it an introduction if I'm going last?
You've already done the work. You wrote the book.
I know, but it doesn't matter because you have to then, it's much harder to condense it. So I am going first.
You're going first, yes.
Agreement on this? Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank the Dean's office, Harlow, Betty Howe, and everybody else who was involved in the work to make this possible. We had to shift so many times because of COVID. It was something of a nightmare, I have to say. I mean, different people came in and out. The policies kept changing. But anyway, thank you. Okay, I'm sure. So, by the way, this is a co-authored book. I didn't write this alone. And it's not the first time I've written a book with my co-author, Andrew Arado, but he couldn't be here today. So we wrote this book in 1920-21, which was one of the worst years until 1920, and 2020-21, God, which was one of the worst years until this year, given the global COVID pandemic, the exacerbating extreme inequality, the growing desperation due to persecution and climate change, prompting the most massive refugee migration crisis since World War II, and the rise of authoritarian populists to power in almost every region. So not least was the coup de grace to the myth of American exceptionalism, dealt by the brazen attempt of a sitting president to use the big lie technique to deny the results of a free and fair election, and to foment an armed insurrection to block the peaceful transfer of power. The seriousness of this threat to constitutional democracy continues as the capture and movementization of the Republican Party witnesses. Now, unlike fascists, populist parties don't openly aim at regime change. They situate themselves within the democratic imaginary, engaging in competitive elections to get into and keep power. But populism has, we argue, an authoritarian logic that fosters regime change once the populists are in power, even if we don't include authoritarianism in our definition. So we write as critical theorists, acknowledging that constitutional democracy is always an unfinished project, and arguing that halting or the reversal of democratic expansion opens the door to the populist challenge. We don't call for, however, a return to the status quo ante of liberal democracy, but rather acknowledge the many internal flaws and strains current developments put on that system and the need for further democratization. We analyze three deficits: the democracy representation deficit, the welfare deficit, and the solidarity deficits regarding culture and status issues. By highlighting these deficits, especially in the movement party stage and civil society, populists make important critical points. But the way these are thematized, typically fomenting a politics of resentment, and the logic of the populist alternative leads to extreme effective political polarization and to political authoritarianism when populists come to power, not to further democratization justice or status honor for those who are losing it. Our attitude towards liberal democracy and populism is that of imminent critique. We defend the counterfactual norms that could lead to better institutionalizations and take seriously the critical dimension against strong authoritarian tendencies and populism. We learn from the crisis of liberal democracy, of which populism is a key symptom, and try to point to alternatives to liberal conservatism and populist authoritarianism. Okay, now we know that populism is a contested concept and a polemical one, like many others. We combine, as I said already, we combine the methods of immanent critique and ideal type to develop a conceptual analysis that's empirically informed and critically useful. The immanent critique is of the best available theories. I include among these Laclau, Mouffe, Canavan, and it confronts democratic norms with strongly authoritarian tendencies of populist governments already decipherable in the movements. We combine this with an ideal type constructed from the value relevant standpoint, this is Weber, of commitment to political democracy, drawing on empirical cases while avoiding definitional essentialism. Okay, so accordingly, I'll do it real quick. Populism entails a strategy of political mobilization to get governmental power that invokes populist sovereignty allegedly violated by the corrupt establishment, an ideologically thin construction of the people using chains of equivalence among heterogeneous demands and constituencies that rely on a thick host ideology, socialism to the left, sometimes, nationalism, and even neoliberalism, as in the case of Fujimori. The symbolic representation of the people by mobilized part, pars pro toto logic, the embodiment of this part typically in a leader with whom the people identifies, a friend-enemy model of politics, pitting the people against the corrupt establishment and its beneficiaries and allies, focus on constitutional politics, the politics of the extraordinary, and insistence on the unconstrainable constituent power, and reliance on electoral competition. Okay, so of course, this ideal type can be contested like any other, and I expect that from my commentators. But the advantage of ideal type analysis is that it allows us to analyze a variety of really existing populisms as movement in and as the government, although no empirical form fully matches the typology. So if populism captures the executive in a presidential system or a parliamentary majority, it is in government. But its project has become the government, given its unitary definition of the embodied populist sovereign and its unconstrainable will. It will try to capture other governmental branches, the courts, and to delegitimate the opposition and undermine constitutionalism, crossing the threshold to what we call hybrid populist regimes. We can talk about that later. So a key thesis of the book is that populism is made possible by the political contradictions of modern constitutional democracy between populist sovereignty and constitutionalism, but also that it responds to some combination of representation, cultural status, and economic deficits. And we argue this in 5 chapters, and I'll be brief. So the first takes up the question of why and why now. We analyze 3 time frames: the long-term structural phenomena, middle-term crisis tendencies, and short-term structural factors in actual crises. Well, I'll leave that here. I mean, I will say, however, that structurally, the point of entry for populist political entrepreneurs is there from the beginning of constitutional and representative democracy, and the gaps that are involved in the fact that no representative democracy is ever inclusive enough, democratic enough, or just enough. They purport to close those gaps. In the next chapter, we turn to the dynamics of anti-establishment populist movements and parties, analyzing the distinctive logic of what I call populist catch-all movement parties and how these undermine the party system and democracy itself. The book then turns to populist governments and their logic, distinguishing, as I already implied, between populists in government. Most of the apologists of populism never get to this stage, although Ernesto Laclau is Argentine. It's pretty astonishing that he didn't get to this, considering that well, Perón was in power for quite some time. But anyway, so populists in government where they control one institutional branch, and populists as the government where they control all or most governmental institutions. Our thesis is that populism's authoritarian logic leads them in government to hybridize democracy, to introduce authoritarian elements, or to revive and repurpose already existing authoritarian elements in constitutions and practices, to create power asymmetries in their favor and to strengthen the executive. We describe the relevant techniques ranging from court packing to delegitimizing the opposition while maintaining elections, albeit ones that are decreasingly free or fair and increasingly shift from mechanisms of accountability to mechanisms of acclaim. We address the issue of thresholds, a thorny issue, that populist projects of hybridization. We argue that populist projects of hybridization do aim at regime change. First, from a constitutional democracy, however flawed, to a new hybrid populist regime. That's the concept. And a second threshold from the latter to a full-fledged authoritarian one, which is possible. There's no stage model here. They don't have to be crossed. The latter threshold is crossed not only when elections can no longer be lost in our sham, not only when rights are violated, but when we can speak of a dual state in Ernst Frankel's sense, in which, this is the main point, a dual state doesn't mean that there's some normative, ordinary function of the old Rechtsstaatlich legal system and then some prerogative. No, it means that there is prerogative power in the hands of the executive that can trump and decide the jurisdictional power of other institutions, including the courts. It has, I love this term, I always say it, competence, what the Germans, that's a German term. It means the competence to decide the competences. So once we get there, we're done with a hybrid regime. Arguably, you could say that authoritarian regime is no longer populist. That's open for discussion, but it can be the outcome of populism. Then we zero in on populist constitutional politics, another level in which populists are obsessed with constitutions and constitutional change and the constituent power, which they purport to embody. They pack apex courts, the judiciary, make constitutional change, whether it's through referenda, amendments, again, to perpetuate power asymmetry and to lock in their own power and the changes that they have made. We end with some reflection on alternatives to populism, stressing the need to rescue popular politics from populism, and some elements of the host ideologies, especially socialism, democracy, and nationalism, from populist deformation, to avoid the politics of resentment and to order and to develop inclusive frames that address status anxieties as well as inequality and representational deficits. So thank you. I look forward to the comments.
So we're just going to go in this order down here. So Jedediah, please start.
Hi, Jed Purdy. Please pardon my wearing the mask as I speak. I have an unvaccinated person and a pregnant person in my household. Let me amplify the thanks to Harlow, who worked unrelentingly. I'm just tempted to say tirelessly in the cliche, but you're probably tired, as we all are. But thank you so much for doing what it took to land this. And thank you, Jean Cohen, and in absentia, Andrew Arato. I found a lot to celebrate in Populism and Civil Society. The account of populism as identifying a part of the polity with the whole, a sort of illiberal synecdoche, shared, of course, with Jan Werner Müller, seems to me key. The emphasis on the place the friend-enemy distinction plays in making contemporary politics often vicious and unworkable, indeed. The identification of a thin ideology, or perhaps mentality, whose chain of equivalences constructs the political terms of anathema and combat, yes. And few, I think, would disagree that personalization of leadership to the point of claims to embody movements and even peoples is a hallmark of this politics. And the authors are surely right that a politics with these characteristics can make recurrent recourse to referenda and appeals to the constituent power a corrosive hallmark of its strategy. Something I think is at stake, both descriptively and normatively, in how we understand the place that these aspects of populism play in furnishing a working definition. The part-whole substitution, the illiberal synecdoche, indicates a basic normative departure from, even an attack on, the political equality, inclusiveness, and pluralism of contemporary democracy. It strikes me as key to the threat of populism. Some of the other features, as the authors acknowledge, may be at once more general features of contemporary politics, and perhaps, I'd add, more contingent as features of a troubling populism. Personalization, one thinks of Macron and even Obama. Friend enemy, when about 90% of both Donald Trump supporters and Joe Biden supporters in 2020 told pollsters that a victory by the other side would do lasting damage to the country, they indicated that the logic of that election, which had the highest turnout in the US since 1900, was friend enemy on both sides. I don't doubt that the Biden supporters had a better point, but some have friend enemy politics foisted upon them. Chains of equivalences, the author's proposals for new political narratives, recognize that everybody in politics will likely be working with this sort of thinly theorized interpretation. So perhaps, and this is, I think, not even an amendment, but a certain friendly light, perhaps pride of place goes to the normative feature of the definition, the identification of what I call the illiberal synecdoche. Some of these features of our politics are destructive and also widely shared, and they're all bad when tied to a politics that denies political equality, pluralism, and inclusion. I admire, too, the author's recognition that populism should be understood as a response to real and deep deficits in contemporary society and politics. Saliently deficits of democracy, of solidarity or recognition, and of welfare. I celebrate their goal of a revival of social democracy as a response to the deficit of welfare, and indeed of solidarity, perhaps. And I admire their efforts to contribute to more salutary and constructive political narratives, ways that a democracy can learn to see itself, to adapt a phrase of the late Stanley Cavell's. Their call for an embrace of the pluralism of democracies also has great force. Surely part of the reason for the fevered and fantastical tone of much of today's politics is the lack of the experience of self-rule, with its powers, its constraints, its frustrations and responsibilities in everyday institutional life. It's a hallmark of politics across the board today that on the one hand, much is asked of it, and it pervades everything. So taste, style, place of residence, gender performance, all become partisan markers. But at the same time, politics, is haunted by nihilism and despair, a suspicion that it achieves nothing, can only be a forum for emotional stimulation and release, and for the affirmation of identities that have already been formed as partisan. At least in the country I know best, this one, this nihilism, or at least pessimism, seems to me to be an enabling condition of the fundamentally destructive politics of populism. Our populism is often a pseudo-mobilization, a concert of feeling and gesture which absorbs voting and occasional riots, is characteristic of consumerism in an economy where much of what we're sold is a stylized version of our own supposedly special identities, resentments, and half-secret wishes. This populism is, at its popular level, which is to take nothing away from its threat to the regime, a politics for people who have forgotten what democratic politics is, a revival of politics in the sense in which the short-lived Emperor Julian revived the pagan forms in Christian Rome. So there's an important question in the book, as in much other important work from the authors, about how to understand the constituent power, the power of constitution making in democracy. There's a basic division of sensibility, contrast of sensibility, which I don't think we'll resolve today, between the view that popular sovereignty is, and I hope I don't misrepresent, a bewildering inheritance from political theology, which puts a mythic people in the place of God, and the view, on the other hand, that it's a regulative principle, dangerous when naturalized into any pre-political or so-called organic people, but nonetheless appropriately institutionalized in majoritarian or supermajoritarian procedures to promulgate, reaffirm, or revise fundamental law. work in which it's no more fictional than other kinds of political will formation and not essentially more dangerous. I indicate this point of contrast merely so that it's in front of us. In practice, I'm not sure what difference it makes. So to be concrete, I think the real task and challenge that the book leaves all of us facing is one, really many, of political judgment. Take the case of the United States. The authors don't defend the anti-democratic, hard-to-amend, judge-captured condition of American constitutionalism, in which we might say that in the usual English translation of Franco, the jurisdiction over jurisdictions falls to the Supreme Court. I agree with them in not defending that particular condition of constitutionalism, if it merits the name. Having spent half of a professional lifetime among progressive law professors and legal reformers, I don't think any effort to pluralize US constitutional politics from within in the registers of, say, popular constitutionalism is going to get us very far. And our populism is directly dependent on our constitutional structure, because the Republican Party is shaped around a program of minority rule that depends on such anti-democratic institutions as the Senate, Electoral College, and Supreme Court, and because the Constitution itself, as a brooding, effectively unamendable omnipresence in American politics, conjures up the idea of a true or constitutional people to which one can always point against current majorities. It's sometimes hard for me to see a way forward here that does not involve a risky re-thematization of popular constituent power in favor of a more majoritarian national politics, not in place of, but as the necessary means to, the pluralism of democracies that the authors propose. But this way is fraught with danger. Where are the lines between popular sovereignty as political machinery and popular sovereignty as fevered myth, between opposition and enmity, between the need for a part of the people to stand in for the whole in any non-consensual political decision, and the danger of naturalizing that substitution? These questions are not so much criticisms as observations about what follows from any limning as rich as this one of the political distinctions that we need to bring, the principled distinctions that we need to bring to our politics, particularly a treatment as rich in observation and clear as in moral judgment as this one. It leaves us with work to do and judgments to make, and for that, thank you very much.
That's it. We have Mabel Berezin from Cornell University.
Okay, I want to begin by thanking Jean Cohen and Andrew Wawro for the invitation to engage with and celebrate their conceptually rich and substantively important book, and to Harlow for managing the event and all her many emails that we had in the last couple of months. So I think I'm the only non-Columbia person here. I'm going to just say I've been working my entire career on right-wing politics of various sorts and threats to democracy. And I've read many of the theories of populism and democracy that the book discusses, but I'm not in practice a social or political theorist. And this is important to note at the beginning because it affected the way I interrogated the book, which I read more as a historian might, and I kept sort of asking myself as I read it and read through different points in it. I kept measuring some of the arguments against cases that I've been working on, mainly in contemporary Europe right now, and particularly, at least at the moment, in France. So my strategy today is to actually talk about the things that stood out to me in this book and things that I thought could be analytically useful moving forward for those who are not necessarily theorizing a new sort of populist imaginary. So the first thing, I'll make 3 points. I was given, I think there were 10 minutes we were allowed here. So first, I will situate the book broadly in political theory and comparative politics. So the first question is, why another book on populism? Since 2016, Brexit and Trump here, they seem to be pouring out suddenly. And the authors raised this point themselves at the beginning, so I don't mind raising it myself. And having read many of these prior works, many of which I've been critical of, I approached populism with skepticism, to say the least. And I ask of this book the same that I would ask of others: what is it going to tell me that goes beyond what is already written? And the answer, of course, is I did find much in this book that went beyond what is already written. From the beginning, the author's own answer, their claim to why write another book on populism, is this whole notion around the democratization of democracy. And I understood that to be an important point, the internal critique of democracy that allows, and what struck me as most important about this, is it allowed a left as well as right variation of populism and a discussion of that. And that's something that you often do not get in many of these other theorists of populists, many of the ones that you cited or the ones that get cited over and over again. And I won't mention their names but they're definitely in the book. Now, a virtue of the Cohen-Arado book is that it adds complication and dynamism to what is usually flat and simply descriptive. Now, I'm vastly generalizing there, but a central trope in the standing literature is the relation between a simple people against a ruling elite, and then everything sort of flows from that kind of tension, as it was, if there is anything below. And Cohen and Arado do go over some of that landscape, which was also just the speaker before me also went over some of it. But what they then do is recategorize the categories in what I think to be analytically useful ways, what they call their ideal types. So to list some of them, populism is a strategy of political mobilization. People can be filled, the term people can be filled with various content. It's not just this sort of empty space, as it were. Again, they highlighted the notion of the unitary people, the notion of a leader, the friend-enemy dichotomy, the strong notion of the political, and a willingness and a commitment to electoral competition, which you find in populism, or what's being called populism, as opposed to fascism and authoritarian regimes. But they don't just leave them there, but what's important to think about this book is they work with these categories, and they work with the various ways these categories combine in different spaces, which makes the book complicated, but in a good way. And the reason it's complicated in a good way is because it allows one to see various relations that appear puzzling at face value. For example, why certain social groups support political projects that do not appear to be in their interest. Classic example from the United States, the evangelical Christians who supported Donald Trump. So virtually anyone who writes about populism of the right-wing variety view it as a threat to democracy in one way or other. But this book, in contrast to some, if not all, takes the concept of populism very seriously as a political category and works through its various dimensions and lays out precisely why and how it is a threat. It also leads me to say, if one had to read only one book on populism, this elegant, well-written, and provocative book should be it. Now, my second point, what stands out to me in terms of moving forward analytically, is the working with some of these old concepts in new ways, and the working with certain taken for granted relationships. And I thought the concept of people as an empty signifier, which is often mentioned in the book, was very, very important. Because it's something that if you read a lot of the sort of background literature on populism, it's just thrown out there, even by the most sophisticated of social theorists. It's just there, and it's as though that there was some concrete reality attached to it. And I think it's very important to the notion that it is a form that can be filled, and it's filled in various ways in various places. And it's one of the reasons why populism is such a sort of, it can often be a non-specific, but also a very fungible context. I did realize as I was going through the book a couple of times and focusing on that particular point, and I'd like to actually hear what you have to say about this, I realized that you didn't theorize the concept of citizen in the book. And I was wondering about that, given the fact that it is a legal category that sort of at least frames it different particular institutional spaces of people. So I was wondering about that. It was already spoken about the discussion of the taken for granted relationship between constitutionalism and democracy, as well as the procedural versus normative discussions of constitutions. I was very taken with, but I think it was covered in the last speaker. The concept in here that really jumped out to me was the notion of the host ideology. And it was indeed one of my favorite formulations in the book, because one of the major things that people critique populism for is its ideological thinness is usually considered constitutive of populism. But our authors in the book push on this idea, and what is usually considered thin is a failure to see the multiple aspects of the populist position in various contexts. So the host ideology to me is a cogent concept because it allows us to see populism's capacity to harness or feed off contingent ideologies that are already coherent ideologies that are already in place. Probably another reason why analysts in general come up short when they try to come up with a unique definition of populism. I like the metaphor. I like thinking about biology and parasites and the parasitical nature of some of these ideologies, but also some of these ideologies are benign isn't the right word, but a variant of social democracy is hardly a parasitical ideology. There is a benign, and the concept of hospitality is also in that. My last point, what is to be done, which plays off the last chapters of the book, which I found very compelling. And this is where I thought the book really moves forward, and where I think that the distinction between left and right populism mentioned earlier really matters. First, when thinking about the future or how to combat populism and strengthen democracy, it is very clear from reading the book that geography matters. Many of the theorists cited in the book reflect on Latin American populism. My colleague Ken Roberts was cited quite a bit, Kurt Wayland, and of course Laclau and Mouffe. And these the concept of host ideology also informs the theorizing of the theorist, as well as the people for whom these ideologies are or are not resonating. And I'm bringing this up because I guess in my thinking about this, I would want to somehow separate Europe from the United States and certainly from Latin America in moving forward, and try to sort of really pick apart what the differences are in terms of I guess just go back to geographical locations. Second, of the scholars who write about populism and try to explain Trump or Brexit, and I'm sure you're all familiar with these arguments, there has emerged a monocausal explanation of populism either being a result of economics or culture, and culture meaning identity influences, and these deficits, either of the economic or cultural sort, are what's driving populism forward. But as is discussed in the book here and in other empirical studies, on the ground, the reality is a bit more complicated. And what is required in order to overcome the populist or anti-democratic temptation, and now I'm taking this from the book here, is a kind of empathy of the social location of those who are attracted to populist solutions, in other words, to move forward. So that a lot of these kind of world we have lost arguments or specifications with the somewhere people versus the everywhere people. Again, people have lost their space. This is often a story told in the United States. I'm sure many of you know the book Hillbilly Elegy or Arlie Hochschild or the French fiction of Nicolas Mathieu. All of these things, chapter 5, and particularly the last section, really sort of present a compelling case of why we need to sort of get beyond that kind of a dichotomy and trying to understand what's happening. What I think is how the authors do this is, first of all, they treat economic culture in separate sections. So there's a discussion of economic host ideology and one on culture. And though it is a blended story, I think it's very good the way they pull it apart. So the economic one, in the economic story, you see deficits, material and conceptual normative deficits in welfare state phenomena, and also in the renewal of social democracy, because it begs the question of how you include persons in a policy based upon either redistributive politics or labor rights. Again, under the umbrella of social democracy, there are multiple iterations. It's an old story, it's an important story, but it's a story that needs to be expanded. In the culture, in the chapter on culture, they talk about, or in the segment on culture, they talk about status deficit, and a call for new inclusive politics of social solidarity. I think that that whole discussion of social solidarity is a very important discussion, because again, it raises the issue that it's neither culture nor economy alone, and what's required is some kind of a conversation between these two, and this is why solidarity matters. And I had a question here, because you talk in this section about chains of equivalence. And it seemed to me that in the beginning, and maybe I just didn't understand this, there was a critique of that, but in the section beginning on page 209 in the book, you actually talk about it as a positive thing, because chains of equivalence is one of those things that can work in both ways. That is, you can have equivalences that focus on commonalities rather than differences. And some of these things that they mentioned are things like belonging, moral integrity, family, patriotism. They can run in two directions. They don't have to simply be patriarchy, religious monopolies, ethno-nationalism, etc. I'm just going to leave with one question, though, because I do think might be worth thinking about a little bit more, and particularly in this section about how to make things, how to move forward. And one of the host ideologies that's very important in the European context, and slightly different in the American context, is the issue of nationalism as a host ideology. And nationalism is often not discussed when people discuss populism, because they simply discuss it as, one of the bad features of populism. But it is an ideology, a host ideology. It is an ideology of commonality. It can it can combine culture and economics. And there is, I don't know if I want to call it intellectual fad, but let's say intellectual thread that's starting to emerge. Francis Fukuyama, about a week ago, just wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying how, everybody needs a place, everybody needs a nation, and maybe we can come up with a progressive nationalism. He didn't exactly say it that way. Stephen Walt just wrote the same thing, a little differently, but basically the same idea. And there is a kind of need, much like there's need to talk about family and belonging, et cetera, for the reality and materiality of placeness. And I've often written that nationalism is not simply an emotion, but it's often embedded in a host of institutions, in institutional arrangements, things like how nation states sort of legislate institutions of solidarity, such as education, military, language, religion, etc. And nationalism is sometimes embedded in preambles to constitutions. So my final question, because I want to ask one question here, is how does the theory of populism deal with nationalism, aside from just a list of categories? And I think there should be a way, perhaps, to think about incorporating nationalism into a sort of democratic civil society, because it is a host ideology. And more importantly, it doesn't go away. And it does fit in some ways with commonality. And it is a large and often confusing component of the writings on realities of populism. So I'm going to basically conclude there. Populism literature has lacked an engaging narrative of political possibility. And I think that Jean Cohen and Andrew Wawro have gone a long way towards theorizing what a more democratic and inclusive political future would look like in their magnificent book. And it is certainly far more nuanced and complicated and deeper than I can possibly do justice to in 10 minutes. So thank you.
Mabel. Next we have Cheri Berman.
Okay, well, let me start off, as my colleagues have, by both thanking one of the authors of this book for writing something that helped me think through issues and topics that I spent a lot of time thinking about, but in a new way, and for inviting me to be on this panel so that I could do it in a somewhat more systematic manner than I would have had I just picked up the book and read it on my own. So like Mabel, I want to start off just by saying that I'm not a political theorist, I'm a comparativist. So while there's a lot of overlap between the way different kinds of disciplines or subdisciplines would approach the topic of populism, there are important differences between comparativists and political theorists. So I preface that by saying that some of my points or questions may seem a little unfair, and so you can take them as such if you want to. So when I look at this giant, as Mabel said, and as I'm sure everybody in this room, because you're here to listen to a presentation on this great new book, knows, this literature on populism now is vast. I mean, it is just monstrous. And I would say it's sort of divided into four main categories. And one of the notable things about this book is it actually addresses all four of them. The first, which Jean spent some time talking about, is what populism is, right? This is the definitional or conceptual issue. How do we understand populism? What makes it distinctive? How can we identify it as opposed to other types of political movements or ideologies? I think the definition or the conception that Jean put forward is a perfectly reasonable one. I think this debate has sort of reached its endpoint, right? Like, okay, how many more times do we need to discuss this? Fine, I think one needs to establish it, what your conception is, and move on. The second category is what causes populism, right? Why do we have populism now? And why do we have it where we do as opposed to others, right? So populism has existed for a long time, but it really has grown over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's grown in some places, but not others. And so understanding what the causes of that are, that's obviously really important. I would say that literature too is quite vast, to my mind, more interesting than the first literature. And I'm going to come back to that because one of the things that I think is distinctive about this book is that it deals with what I'm going to say is the fourth topic by reference to the second one. So if the first is the definitional and conceptual, the second is the causes. The third, which Jean also talked a little bit about, is what populists do when they're in power, right? So, what is it that they do that undermines but does not necessarily destroy democracy, right? What are typically populist strategies? What makes them different from out and out authoritarians? They claim notoriously to be Democrats, but not liberals or pluralists. How does that matter in the way that they rule? And what are the implications of that for the types of democracies that we have left, right? And so here, as Jean said, there's this kind of concept of a sort of hybrid type of a hybrid type of regime or a hybrid type of strategy that ends up being distinctive to populism, right? The typical, they hollow out a lot of the institutions and norms. They use them in ways that are maybe by the book, but sort of undermine their substance. And so there's a nice treatment of that aspect. The third one, what populists do in power. The fourth topic, and this one actually I think is the one where the most remains to be said, is what can be done to counter populism, right? And I would say actually that the most remains to be said because up until relatively recently, actually, oddly enough, this was not a topic that was deeply dealt with by the literature, partially perhaps because populism was relatively new. And this is obviously the most important thing that any book or article or essay, I think, can contribute at this point, only because the other three really have been dealt with ad nauseum. What I think is really nice about this book, in addition to actually dealing with that fourth topic, is that it does so in a way that takes seriously strategies that are directly related to the causes of populism. And I say that because the treatments that we've had thus far about how to counter populism, how to deal with populism, have been relatively thin. And I use that word advisedly because I'm not sure it means the same thing in comparative politics as it does in political theory. So they focused on things like the need for oppositions to be united and to prioritize democracy over their own programs. They've talked about the kinds of strategies, for instance, that were used by mayoral candidates in Istanbul and in other cities in Turkey, the names of which I'm forgetting, okay, right? And the idea there was be positive, right? Don't focus on attacking your opponents and definitely not attacking their supporters. Put forward a positive vision, keep everything on the sort of, we are here to kind of make your lives better, not to tell you how shitty Erdogan and his supporters are. And then the third kind of treatment, which does come a little bit from political theorists, is this kind of dancing around the idea of a sort of militant democracy, right? Different kinds of institutional mechanisms that we can put in place to keep nasty people from gaining power. Now, all those things are useful, but what's really, I think, helpful about this book is pushing us forward to something deeper, right? If we want to counter populism, we need to do that by understanding what its causes are. And here, the book takes a kind of tripartite perspective that I think is important. But I'm gonna ask Jean if she wants to maybe elaborate a little bit more, having written this book a year or two ago. So the first one, and the one that you mentioned the most, is, and this is kind of pulling out of, sort of what I see as a pretty standard kind of approach in political theory, but one that comparativists don't do so much, is understanding that populism has to be situated within what you refer to as the democratic imaginary, right? That is to say that we should understand populism as a response to the political contradictions of modern constitutional democracy or representative government. That is to say, populism is an inevitable response when democracy fails, right? And in particular, when it fails in its representative functions, right? When people feel alienated and unheard, populism is a kind of inevitable result from that, right? So if you understand that, right, in comparative politics, we talk about representation gaps, right? In political theory, you talk about the democratic imaginary. It's the same kind of idea, right? Which is, if people feel unheard, if they feel alienated, if they feel like their needs and their grievances are not being responded to, they're going to be open to the appeals of parties and movements and politicians who say that they're going to respond to those things. They're going to take them seriously, right? And so if you want to actually counter populism, right, you need to take that grievance, you need to take that widespread dissatisfaction seriously. And so one of the things the book does is says that, look, if we're going to deal with populism, right, we need to expand and improve and not simply restore democracy, because there are a lot of people out there who feel unheard, who feel like their needs and grievances are not being responded to, right? So you need a democratic alternative to populism. That is to say, a movement or a party that takes the deficits in democracy seriously, right? So the deal with the democratic deficit in particular countries, and not just, like, for instance, in the European Union, right? Democratization is a never-ending process, right? So then the question is, practically, because I'm a comparativist, what does this mean, right? How do we make democracy more responsive? How do we make it actually better able to address the grievances of aggrieved citizens without sliding into the nasty territory that populists do, right? Because their solution is, let's get rid of establishment institutions, let's get rid of established parties, let's make a direct connection between the leader and the people, let's get rid of checks and balances, let's engage in all these kinds of things that will ostensibly make democracy more responsive to the people, but we all know is not going to do anything really of the sort. So what is the practical alternative there, right? So citizen assemblies, the Chilean constitutional process, the devolution of power to the local level, which is mentioned in this book. Like, these are the kinds of things that people have been talking about, right? But what does it mean? How do we make democracy more responsive in a way that maintains its liberal and its democratic character, as opposed to the solutions that populists actually put forward, right? And I'd like to maybe engage on that a little bit more, because I think this is really where the book is pushing us and where we need to go. I will note, by the way, that this devolution of power to the local level also has many things in this book, and I'm sure you're very aware of this even more than I'm. There's a conservative version of this as well,
yeah.
right? And so again, it's very important to think about practical solutions, but that maintain that commitment to liberal democracy and maybe progressivism. Okay. All right, let me stop there. Okay, so in addition to the democratic deficit, representation gaps, all that kind of thing, the other thing the book points out is there are two other major gaps that are driving populism, right? The first is the kind of economic or welfare deficit, right? Now, this one in some ways, and you say this in the book, is the easiest, right? Because what you advocate here is a kind of revitalized social democracy, right? The type of policies, the type of movements and parties that take the negative consequences of capitalism seriously and take as therefore important, making sure that people aren't subject to the kind of insecurity that drives them into the arms of people who sell them cheap and easy solutions, right? The reason why you're suffering and your communities are screwed up is because immigrants are coming and taking your resources, because establishment elites don't care about you and look down upon you, blah, 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 blah. Now, important to note, of course, is that populists recognize this too, right? And so populist parties in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe have been very good at offering a kind of right-wing version of welfare states, of protectionism. And also anybody who follows this debate in the United States today knows there is now a very significant movement on what would have been considered the conservative right now of people who are engaging in exactly the kinds of critiques of capitalism that have long been the preserve of the left. There are a lot of intellectuals and others who are now, again, using new magazines and new kinds of endeavors to kind of track out what a conservative version of a welfare state would look like, even in the United States, a place where the right has historically not been interested in those kinds of things. Why? Because that's where the aggrieved voters are, right? So it's not just Tucker Carlson, right? There's now an entire intellectual movement of people on the right who call themselves, my God, there is a new magazine, it's called, what is it, Compass? Compact, right? They call themselves social democrats. It drives me bonkers, right? It drives me bonkers, but that's what they're calling themselves precisely because they recognize these kinds of things. This welfare deficit is a source of grievance and it has to be addressed, right? So the question is then, how do we get people on the left to be able to sell this in such a way that people will buy it? Because people on the right are very aware that this is an important thing driving dissatisfaction today. And then the third, of course, is the social and cultural, right? The sense by a lot of people that the world that they live in is not one that they understand, where they're not valued, and where they're not just not valued, but where they're actually shat upon by people like us, right? You know, you mentioned all those books, The Politics of Resentment, Hillbilly Elegy. Now, look, I think probably a lot of us are not particularly sympathetic to some of these things, but this sense of aggrievement is real. And if we care about democracy, again, the key thing is coming up with ways to address that do not slide into the ways in which the right-wing populists address it. Now, one of the things that I thought was slightly daring in this book, might I say, was that I thought this part, right? So if the first is dealing with the democratic deficit, the second was dealing with the economics. The third part here, I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, a not insignificant critique of the way the left has dealt with this kind of stuff, right? That in particular, the book points out that you cannot mirror the friend-enemy distinction. You simply cannot call those people who are supporting right-wing populists deplorables and their functional equivalents, right? You can't do that because you're definitely going to lose them if you do. It also creates this kind of vicious cycle of escalation, right. As Jed mentioned, right now, everybody, you know, people on the left think Republicans are a threat to democracy. Surveys make clear that Republicans think Democrats are too. Now, again, I agree with you. I think most of us in this room think that one side has a better argument than the other. But if you listen to them, I mean, they think, you know, that we are trying to, you know, rob them of their way of life, that we are trying to, you know, cheat them of all of the things that make their communities and America great. And, you know, if you just kind of say, look, that's wrong and stupid, it may be emotionally satisfying, but it's not dealing with the problem. And so one of the things that this book does, I think, again, gently, but significantly, is say, look, the left needs a better way of dealing with these kinds of grievances and these kinds of problems, right? We need an inclusive politics of social solidarity. You reject the idea of returning just to class, which I'm sort of sympathetic to. But the question is then, how do we do that, right? Like, how do we get a social solidarity? I think Mabel was maybe talking a little bit about this with this question of nationalism, right? It is very hard to have a well-functioning country, much less a well-functioning liberal democracy, without some sense of social solidarity, right? It just, you know, people on the left, I think, don't fully get this. It just doesn't work, right? And so pretending that you can have that, right, without some basis for that kind of social solidarity is basically ceding to the right the ability to speak that language and to claim those themes. So the question then becomes, how do we do that, right? How do people who care about liberal democracy, particularly from the left, create a sense of social solidarity that takes seriously the concerns of some of our citizens, right? And addresses them rather than poo-poos them or rejects them without sacrificing its own principles. So I will stop by saying, look, I think one of the things that this book should be absolutely commended for, right, is taking on all of those aspects of populism studies. But I think it does the first three very well, right? But I think it's this last one about where do we go from here, or as what Mabel said, what is to be done? I think this is where the literature needs to go now.
Yeah.
And I think this is where people who care about liberal democracy and people who care about the left in particular need to think much more clearly, right? An endless escalation where we're like, these people are terrible, they're threats to democracy, and so our only job is to do whatever we can do to win, right? That is a bad strategy for democracy. That is a bad, telling everyone that, look, these people are not democratic and they are illiberal, and so we are going to mirror their tactics so that we can win. That is not a winning strategy over the long term. So figuring out how to do these things, I think, is really where the literature should go next. And I really commend you for taking this on. And I think sort of, again, trying to gently prod the left on some of the things that it's done that you think are not fully sufficient. So thank you very much.
Ed has to run off to teach, so we're going to let him go. But I want to say thank you to the panelists for their insightful comments. And I think it's, there's only one political theorist on this panel, but I think it's a testament to the importance of this book that all of them had, there's a lot of meat that they could dig into this book. So thank you. And so, Jean, you have 10 minutes to respond to
Well, I was
questions.
going to respond to
before we
Jed,
open up
but in
to
absentia.
questioning.
But it's a general point. So, okay. He said something about, that the dimension that he likes about the definition is this illiberal synecdoche, which, John Werner Muller, populism is anti-pluralist. Maybe somebody else said something along those lines. I mean, the what is it thing. The problem with that, I mean, that's part of it, partly true, is that I think it misses what an ideal type is. Everybody's gotta go back and read Marx. No, I mean, an ideal type is not a definition. It has elements that it constructs from a perspective, value relevance, supposedly value free, but anyway. And the point of this is to articulate elements and to enable you that you draw these from empirical reality, but you also approach empirical reality with it, so that you will find cases that approximate, let's say, 3 or 4 of the type, the elements of the type, or 5 or 6. And so, in other words, it's not enough to say that populism is just isn't a liberal syndicate. Plenty of things are. So, I mean, I think that that one needs to grasp that what the immanent critique and ideal type methodology is meant to do is to, of course, you can criticize it, but is to provide a framework with which to approach, and then you can assess, well, is this populist or not? What's missing? How close does it get? And et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's very important. And that just focusing on one dimension of it won't allow you to assess the empirical reality. It also misses the concept of what an ideal type is meant to do. The other, also, I mean, if you look at it idealistically, you can also see threats and the way in which things are moving and try to counter them. What was the other thing? Yeah, it is, well, he's not here, but there's the issue of constitutionalism. And, I really thought that he was going to ask me, because I know what he does, about hybrid regimes. Yeah. And isn't the United States a hybrid regime? I was like, hoping somebody would ask me that. But considering all the stuff that he mentioned.
Someone's going to ask, someone asked you, pretend someone asked you.
So the electoral college, there's a lot of elements at the filibuster. There's a lot of elements on the constitutional level and on the everyday level, or the institutional level, let's put it that way, that we could say they look like authoritarian enclaves. Some of them might have been put in there as authoritarian enclaves, some not. I don't think the Senate was meant as an authoritarian enclave to allow. No, I mean, you're making a federation. They weren't going to join. So, but these things can shift in their function and can be used differently now, which, in the hands of some, they are. I would also say that during the period, I would agree with Ira Cass, that during the period of Jim Crow South from, I don't know, 1908 to when, did it end? Yeah, to 1950s. I mean, this is certainly on the level, VOP argues, on the level of the southern states. You're talking about hybrid regimes, if you're generous. What they then did on the national level in Congress, and I hesitate to say this because the next one here, is they hybridized. They put in place mechanisms that really, undermined so you could do that. But I resist. It's a mistake, to say, oh well, this isn't a democracy, it's a flawed democracy. Because if you go the route of saying it's a hybrid regime or a non-democracy, there's no democracy. There's nothing's democracy. You have to be able to make these distinctions. Anyway, so but the basic when he asked whether popular sovereignty is an inheritance from political theology or a regulative principle, I mean, the point is that the whole point is that it's an inheritance from political theology if you think you can find it, make it the sleeping sovereign awake, embody it, and act in its name. Then it's political theology. He's thinking of the work of, I don't know if he is, but he should be thinking of the work of Claude Lefort, et cetera. But it's a regulative principle. Think of Edmund Morgan and others, and not a myth. If you look at it as regulative principle, as norms that you try to approximate. But for this, it must go together with constitutionalism. It's not opposed to constitutionalism. And we try to argue this very systematically in the book. So I'll leave that alone because he's gone. And of course, the idea of the constituent power. We've had many arguments with fans of this concept, my own former student Andreas Kalivas, et cetera. But you can't leave the constituent power to the populace, then you're in deep, deep trouble. But you can't mythologize it either. And so it can be invoked, not as something that can be found or embodied or tripped over in the streets or something because some people in the streets. I mean, maybe the constituent power stayed home. Maybe they're not the ones in the street. Maybe now. But the thing is that we can't leave the democratization of democracy and even the higher level of transforming and changing the Constitution and its interpretation to the populace or a very rigid Supreme Court, which in our case is linked up to the constitutional problem of a very hard and tough amendment rule, which is the amendment rule of a federation. So it's really hard. I mean, in other words, you have to find an alternative around that, but you can't just cede the punch. So that was for him. So for Mabel Berezin, where are we? Oh yeah, first of all, chance of equivalence is Laclau's term. It's not mine.
Okay.
But on one level, all parties do change of equivalence. Every casual party tries to, sure, I mean, that's just politics. But it's not populism, which he identifies into. He thinks all politics are populist, and that's wrong. But so the thing is that no, I mean, it's not. It depends how you frame this. I mean, there's another important concept that we use. So host ideology is very important, but also the idea of a floating signifier. I mean, you have to get into this linguistic stuff, but it's important.
It was
because
there.
populism can shift from left to right and back again.
Yeah.
It can. Okay. Now, as for citizenship, I guess we didn't push the concept, but the idea of democratization involving inclusion is, of course, expanding the citizenship. And many people try to argue that left populism, especially in Latin America, given it is and Chantal Mouffe never addresses populism and power, but neither does Clout, as I said. Strength, they can't, because it'd be hard to support it if you address it once it's in power. But in any case, so it looks like Morales, or there are a lot of cases where you include, especially certain identity groups, indigenous, the what are they called? Mixed. What? Thank you. Yes. God. You include people who have been excluded or, I mean, in just the history of democratization, from workers to women to everybody. Okay, but with left populism, it looks like left populism is democratic in some instances because it's including the excluded. But we try to argue, and that's about citizenship. I mean, and, not just in giving them formal rights, but voice. But the problem is that you're including them in something that you're in the process of undermining. It's a slight problem, namely democracy. So, and we've seen how that plays out in every instance, from Bolivia to Venezuela, etc. In the populist version, I'm not saying that inclusion has to play out that way. Okay. And then, well, with the nationalism, I'm going to address that with Cheri, because when I reply to Professor Berman's comments, because these are hard questions. I mean, I would say that, yes, of course. I mean, we need identities on every level, okay? But that is not the same thing as identity politics, and that is not the same thing as ethno-nationalism. There are all these, we know these distinctions, ethno-national versus civic nationalism. I mean, I'm the national of a state called the United States. Does that make me a nationalist? And the identity is kind of sick. I go to Europe and I realize that, I am American, whatever that's supposed to be, right? But that is not, so there's nothing wrong with that. You can have patriotism too. But I mean, the problem is that, populists, or the right-wing nationalist populists like Platoon, etc. This is not an inclusionary community project, much as it pretends to be, let's say, in Europe, etc. No, it's an exclusionary one. You are not part of us, and you are not part of us, and you are not. So this is the dimension of nationalism that's problematic. There are deeper issues here that have to do with nation states that I don't really want to get into here. It creates serious problems which aren't already wrote about, I don't know how many years ago. And it looked like federation might be some kind of an alternative, supposedly on the EU level. But it's a deep problem how you would address this. And this is not just a problem of populism; it's a problem of more general. Okay, so for Cheri Berman's comments. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate. I think you really got it. I think you really got the structure and the logic of the book, because it is actually, in some ways, it's relentlessly systematic. It relates to what it is and what causes it to, and the problem, to the end. It's, of course, I agree with you. I think the problem is now how to figure out how to counter populism, and the core problem, which you mentioned, of representation deficits, can be taken back to the deepest structural level of the tension between popular sovereignty and constitutionalism. Pushing one or the other can veer off the path of democracy. One, where you're just liberal constitutionalists, you don't care about democracy. The other is you have some idea of, I don't know, some direct, radical, participatory, I don't know what, democracy, which ends up purporting to substitute as opposed to supplementing democratic forms, and then you also veer off the map. But the tension will not go away, and we have to operate in ways in which they inform each other, as opposed to and enhance each other, because constitutionalism can enhance democracy, of course, rights, checks and balances, counter democracy, which is a really great analysis of Jose Valon, et cetera, and vice versa. So, well, how to make democracy more responsive? That's a tough one, especially the SADC issue. I mean, I think that I feel it's depressing, because this was already, the idea of the plurality of democracies is already an idea that came out, that we had in our book Civil Society and Political Theory 1,000 years ago. And then we were very optimistic, but we argued for not substituting some mythological direct democracy or citizen forms or whatever they're called for representational democracy, but supplementing, because you do need, I mean, you'd have to think this in a way that you can avoid problems of dual power, which are serious, as you know, but which would allow for more avenues of voice and participation than what exists on the level of democracies today. I mean, a dimension that's left out, which I think is very important, is a crisis of parties and party democracy. It's disastrous. And I analyzed the concept of movement party, I think is really important, but we're all going through this. So I think that, I don't have the answers. I mean, we're all in flux here. I don't know what political form is going to emerge. But I'm very worried about the movementization of parties, the hollowing out of parties and the movementization everywhere. I mean, in France, I'm very happy Macron won, but his so-called party is called it's his initials. EM, it's incredible. And his opponent was, was another movement. So of course you're an authority on fascism, and it sounds frighteningly familiar. Movements against parties. I mean, of course there are parties because they're competing electorally. In my book, that's a party. But why are you calling yourself a movement, not a party? And what's going on? I mean, in the old days, when fascists did that, that's because they hated parliamentary democracy and they thought plurality parties had to go, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's supposedly a different ballgame, but it's a little unclear. And the danger with the movementization of parties is that they have an escalating logic, and they don't normalize when they come into power. So that's a problem. As for well, I mean, again, I agree with you. The welfare thing, I don't think of Bernie Sanders as populist. I think he was a democratic socialist. I wasn't a, what's the word? I didn't feel the burn, whatever that meant. But still, he suggested alternatives that made sense. And, right now in a different constellation, I don't even think Biden is doing so badly. The problem is that the Democratic Party, it shoots itself in the foot all the time. But in any case, in terms of the welfare stuff, meaning addressing the inequalities and losses where they stand, that's not rocket science. I don't think you have to have the political will. The status issue that's the one I actually stress a lot. Is more interesting because I mean, on one level, it occurs whenever there's a transformation, a structural transformation in the nature of the economy and cultural shifts. So people can lose their status, and status anxiety is real. But I don't think populism can be understood as a rear guard, as a rear guard. Well, what I mean to say is that the status issue should not be approached as some kind of irrationalist rear guard domain where you'll give up your values if you try to assuage the real losses that, let's say, I don't know, white working class, groups in the Rust Belt are feeling. I think that you could frame alternatives in a way that would allow for status that would not play into that. It's very hard because the identity politics is so pushed now on both sides, but that would not play into the indignities that go with the loss of a form of life, which has happened ever since we had capitalism initially. Workers losing their form of life, et cetera. But that in ways that could allow for whatever it is, retraining, anything, and that could allow for some sense of dignity and status equality as a possibility. So again, I don't have a formula for this, but I think that given that this is something that is not just occurring once, it occurs all the time. There are transformations in terms of the structure of the economy and culture. I think that we should certainly, as you said, we should certainly not be dismissive of those who are expressing status and anxiety, but address it. Again, I don't have formulas, so I have to end that part with a whimper because it's very hard. I tried to discuss. I mentioned a few themes in the book, but I mean that's very contextual. It's contextual. It would depend on which country you're in, how that works. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jean. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. So I think do we have any online? If we have some in the room, do we have any questions for the panel? Charles, go ahead.
I might add some questions. It's kind of interesting. So 15 years ago, of like then we see a rise of like, populism everywhere. Well, around 15 years ago, when this was the economic crisis of 2008, right? And so I'm wondering, to what extent do we have an idea about? So, like, yes, we talk about grievances and we talk about status anxiety and all this kind of things, but there is also the fact of like increase cost of life.
In
There is
what?
Increased cost of life.
Increase of supply?
Cost of life.
Of course, of life. Oh, okay, sorry.
Diminishing consumer power everywhere, right? And so I'm wondering to what extent there is also kind of the need for the possibility to think of a different kind of economic system, and to what extent the economic system we are in now that allow for unbridled capital accumulation, wealth accumulation, like that allows some people to buy like out Twitter whenever they want, however they want, right? To what extent the system can still like really offer an option, and to what extent we shouldn't like think about different kind of way to organize a society, you know, to not allow for populism, right? Like we were talking about fascism. I'm thinking directly of Gramsci, of course. There was a kind of like attempt at formulating a different kind of organizing around a different kind of economic system. To what extent do we need to really rethink also our economic system now if we want to combat populism?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have to specify what we mean by the system, because if you're talking about capitalism, as opposed to liberal democracy, I mean, as distinct from, I mean, I never know what's meant when we say capitalism replacing with something else. What is this something else? So I think saying capitalism is problem is too, well, I think that we need to have, I mean, I mentioned the welfare deficit that has to do with capitalism, unbridled capitalism, has to do with corporate power. Well, depending where you are in the United States, at least, that has to do with, you know, the stepping back, the withdrawal of political parties, actors from attempting to control. That's what's meant by. I don't want to return to social democracy. I want to have a better version of it. That's especially in the United States, more inclusive. And you know, there were some problems with social democracy. That, you know, there's a crisis of crisis management. We might want to think about doing that differently. So certainly, the political power that's been given to corporate elites domestically and transnationally, and the deregulation, all of this. Yes, I mean, certainly. I mean, again, I mean, Sanders articulated a lot of that. Even Biden did. I mean, Biden's a working class guy, you know. So, you know, I think that yes, this is absolutely has to be done, but we have to be careful. You can't just say, you know, overthrow capitalism. Been there, done that. The outcome was not encouraging, and you have to rethink the relationship between. Well, I mean, you know, what's capitalism? Is China capitalist? Is Russia capitalist? What are we talking about here? So you have to basically rethink the relationship between politics and economics, and democratic politics and economics again. And I don't know whether you want to come up with. I mean, you could call Sanders a counter-hegemony, whatever. But so I do think that's on the agenda and very important, but it takes serious thought.
Yeah, so I have a question that was mentioned already a little bit about the kind of role of the geographic dimension of the divides we're facing in the political sphere, and whether you think that like centralization and decentralization of politics play an essential role here, especially when we think about like movement parties, and then we can think about like certain political systems, of course, like France, and in the US, the extreme focus on the presidency, and so on and so forth, and whether you think that like a decentralization of politics, both institutionally but also geographically, could be important, especially also when we think about the crisis of parties. So I know that in Hungary, for example, I think Fidesz is the only party that has offices like all across the country outside of Budapest. And I think this at least for me, speaks to the geographic dimension of like polarization too, and whether like there should be some sort of
Oh, yeah.
movement of like moving back into the country and trying to kind of
Yes,
break kind of
absolutely.
connection.
Oh, absolutely. So that's, to use a Gramscian term, presenza. So in other words, it is the case that the parties, I know a little bit more about here, although he knows more. They left the terrain, you know? I mean, you, in a way, what's it called? Not invincible, I forget the name of it, but in a way, think of what's, I even mentioned this, what Stacey Abrams tried to do. You have to get, the parties have to get back on the ground. I mean, again, I don't want to call for the recreation of the parties the way they were before, because I'm not a great fan of, you know, the backroom deals and all this, but the failure of parties to develop, you know, it's not just about the internet. As you said, Fidesz is on the ground everywhere. That's what won it for them, not the internet. And so I think that in a sense, political parties have to recreate. I mean, the Tea Party did that, by the way. Recreate, I mean, hopefully Democratic left-leaning parties would recreate their structures, the party on the ground, the party in central office, all of these things that have evaporated, and be present on the local level to speak to people. Yes, not just using the internet or whatever. I think that's really crucial. I don't remember what we said about centralization, decentralization generally. What I meant by, I don't, because, you know, America is a weird place. You're federal. Are we decentralized compared to France? So I think that actually what matters more is a plurality of places in which, or democratic forms in which people can participate. And then one can think about, again, I don't, you know, glorify the local. I don't think, as we know, the local states' rights in this country, the local can be pretty anti-democratic, but that's not the point. The point is to, if necessary, articulate additional forms to which people can participate and supplement, but instead of replacing the existing ones, which are themselves in crisis. So that's good.
Questions?
I kind of had a question. Going off of Professor Berman's point of this like dilemma of like how, to what extent do you offer like a positive approach? To what extent like do you try to take everyone on board, and like at what point does it go against like your own values? And so how do we deal with like interests that are just irreconcilable? And I'm thinking about that because in the environmental theory literature, there's a lot of debate now about like ecological populism, which I think in that context is a bit like actually like not so well conceptualized, but it still gets at this idea that you have to take democracy on board somehow, but you also have to do something now to address the climate crisis,
Yeah.
etc. But that goes against all these interests of like having co-workers, etc.
Yeah.
So how do you?
Well, I mean, you know, when I say you have to take seriously the status anxieties and economic anxieties of people who appear, who are populists appeal to and who seem to, okay, now clearly some of them buy into racist, patriarchal, whatever sets of identities and values. And I certainly don't think we should pander to that, but I'm suggesting that one could formulate projects. So for example, use coal miners, well, you know, invest in alternative technologies there and on the spot. Provide re-education. I mean, you know, training. No, I'm not into the communist thing. Training, that sort of thing. In other words, it may be that these identities are so rigidified now and we're so polarized, who knows, it maybe nothing will work, but I'm not quite sure about that. But in any case, no, I mean, yes, of course there are irreconcilable interests. That's called politics. But the formulation, getting back to the formulation of a project that in the most inclusive terms possible without demonizing avant la lettre people who, you know, who are really suffering, but who don't look like, you know, your typical, you know, I don't know, New York leftist, whatever political correct person. And now there seem to be, who knows who's politically correct at this point, fewer and fewer of them. That's something we must do without sacrificing the basic values. So it's a question of how expansively you can formulate a project in ways that avoid fanning the flames of these identity politics. And it's very hard right now, given where it's gone, from the left and from the right, that's for sure. But the first step you have to have is you don't get guilted out. You cannot be guilted out. No, you don't have to occupy you don't have to assume that your supporters have to occupy the most oppressed position, et cetera. And I've already been through this too many times in my long life. I'm not going back to that. You have to be, I don't know, I'm not going to go through details, but in any case, I think that there's a way to attempt to try to do this if you don't, and certainly without sacrificing your values.
Okay, with that, I think we will call the panel to a conclusion. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And
Thank you.